Okay, hi, I'm doing another book review. This book is called Great by Choice by Jim Collins, and it's recommended to me by a friend, so it's a lot about business. Basically what this guy did, he studied a lot of famous businesses, the ones that achieved 10x or higher revenue growth over a period of time, maybe 10, 20, 30 years, and looked at those against their peers in the industry who didn't have the same kind of growth, try to find out what was the difference between the business leadership to give those companies that growth. And so there's a few takeaways from this. I really like this book actually. It's quite powerful because it explains why some businesses are mediocre or why they have some success and then they fail versus the big companies that really take off and have consistent growth over 30, 40, 50 years in some cases. So he did these studies, and he was specifically looking at the types of qualities that the business leaders have, so the CEOs that come in and make these companies great. And the core traits that he was focusing on was fanatical discipline, empirical creativity, and productive paranoia. And those were the three key traits that he saw the successful businesses have when they had these leaders at their helm with these qualities. So just to dig down a bit into what each of those means, empirical creativity is basically using observation to test and experiment what's working, what's not, and always being quite objective with using numbers. And obviously a lot of businesses do that, but his point is that it's not necessarily about innovation. Innovation by itself doesn't explain the success that these businesses have had. If they don't have the discipline, they don't have the empirical side to it, then the innovation doesn't get capitalized on, and they may get bought out by another competitor years later because their growth or their business wasn't taking off. So I thought that was interesting. He says that in the book that the key thing they had, these leaders, was ambition with a purpose higher than themselves and the kind of way to channel their egos. So that was sort of looking into the future. They had really big goals for where they wanted to take the business. Not just thinking necessarily about how much money they can make in the short term. And the difference between, nowadays there's a lot of CEOs that take shares as compensation, so they're very motivated for short-term growth, and they maybe take more risks than they should or leverage the company up with more debt than they should because they're getting compensated quarter on quarter to, the pressures on them to report that growth, and that's tied to their pay package. So they may sacrifice the long-term growth of their company just because they're trying to get a higher bonus this year. And then you see that in the banking industry. Basically, all these companies are completely over-leveraged, and it's exploded on their face. And so he's kind of looking at how do these companies, like Microsoft, like Apple, they've also had periods of mediocrity, but when a CEO like, Steve Jobs comes back into Apple, how did he turn it around? What was his qualities? What was his principles that led Apple to having such great success? Before him, they were mediocre. So let me look at my notes here. There was some really interesting observations. One of the key things he talks about is preparation. And so this is assuming that conditions could always go against you at any moment in the market, and it's kind of like a paranoia that it pushes you to have really a lot of safety and a lot of buffer in your operations. So you have a lot of cash reserves, for example, and if something hits you unexpectedly, you don't know necessarily when something's going to hit you. It's like a black swan. There's a good book on that about these black swan events, basically, that you can't really see what's happening in the market because there's so much uncertainty and chaos, and really that's accelerating nowadays. So because of technological progress, we're having more uncertainty and more chaos, and these business leaders are having to operate in this environment. So what's the key to success? And he says that preparation is really key because you don't know when the black swan event is going to hit you or hit the market, like the 2008 crash or the 2001 crash. But if you are prepared for it and you can see what's coming, you're better able to deal with it when something happens. So it's not necessarily always reacting the fastest or making panic reactions to a crisis, but that if you're making preparations, ongoing as just part of your business model, you're always prepared for some event to come along, and you can still, work through that. And be successful through that period of a recession or crisis in the market, whereas a lot of companies that are over-leveraged, like the banks were, they just collapse and they fold because they were just thinking very short term, and they were taking a lot of risks. And so this is another one of his themes. about leading below the death line, which means that business leaders are leading their companies, at a level that's driving growth, but it's consistent, and they're not taking crazy risks that could wipe them out. Because if a business has bad luck and they're not prepared, then that he calls that the death line. You're taking that company so close to the death line, there's a chance they might not recover. And if you have 1 or 2 or 3 of those in succession over a short period of time, there's just no chance for the business to recover if they weren't preparing before the event happens. So it's not enough just to try and react to something when it happens, but you need to be preparing all the time for the eventuality that something will happen, even though you can't see what it is, but that something will happen. You need to be prepared for that. And that's through preparation. He tells a really good story about the explorers to the South Pole. I think it was Amundsen from Norway was trying to get there first before Scott. And Amundsen was fanatically disciplined in his preparation. He would go train with the Eskimos. He would go ride with the dogs. He ate like dolphin meat to see what kind of food his body could handle, and he really trained very hard. And he was basically training himself for this event to go to the South Pole. Whereas Scott was just not so prepared, and he thought, I'll just use these motor engines. I can just go and do it very quickly, come back. And he wasn't anticipating, he wasn't preparing, giving himself any buffer. So when it came down to it and he got to the event, things broke down. He didn't have backups, he didn't have backup plans, and basically he never made it back. He died out in the cold, and I think 3 miles from one of their supply centers. So he just broke down. He didn't have what he needed to get out there, and the difference was in that what he calls the 20-mile march. And this is exactly what Amundsen did. It doesn't matter what the weather was like. If it was cold, if it was unbearable, if it was good, he would do 20 miles consistently. And some people in his team would say, we can go further today, we can make more progress because the weather's good. And he would say, no, I don't want to exhaust myself. He knew that you need to maintain a consistent pace. And so he would go 20 miles, between 15 and 20 miles day in, day out, every day, regardless of the weather. Whereas Scott and his team would go all out on days where they thought, the weather's good, and then they would stop and sort of, camp in the tents when the weather was bad, and they would, over exhaust themselves. So that idea of consistency versus, making, spurts and then stopping and going again, it's kind of proving that a 20-mile march is the best way to go in terms of getting that consistent progress and not having success one day and then failure the next, and having this kind of spikes in your business. So that was very interesting how Amundsen was very prepared. And there's another example he gives about this guy called Brad Shears, who went up to the top of Everest to shoot an IMAX film. And he took a ton of extra oxygen tanks and canisters because he really wanted to make sure he had more than enough to get up and down the mountain. And that gave him some buffer, because they got near the top and they decided they couldn't they couldn't go up because the conditions weren't good and there was too many people on the mountain. But they had the buffer. They could come back down and still go back up the next day or the next a few days, because they had enough supplies. But they met other people who were going up and they didn't have enough supplies, so they had like a 1 chance of success. If they didn't go up, they couldn't do it. And so that forced them to take risks they shouldn't have taken, and people died on that mountain. During the expedition that he passed on the way, people were just going up and taking crazy risks. But because this guy had buffer, he had the option to wait a few days, until the conditions improved and there was less climbers on the mountain, less risks, and he was able to get up safely, whereas many other people died. So these kind of true life stories in these, in history like this, it kind of proves how this works in the real world, and you can apply that to your business as well. One analogy I really liked was the idea of firing bullets versus cannonballs, and basically the principle behind that is that when you're testing something new or you're going to a new market, if you're just firing a cannonball, which is like throwing a bunch of money at something, or expanding it into a new product or service line, and you haven't really tested it, then you haven't calibrated whether that's going to work, and you're taking a big risk in that growth, and it's very hit and miss. And something like that, if it doesn't work and you incur a lot of losses, that's going to take you to the death line, where your business may not be able to recover. So the difference between successful businesses that get consistent growth is what they do is they will deploy a small amount of money or a small amount of resources to test something, and they will fire a bullet, see where it lands, refine their aim again, fire a bullet, keep firing bullets, and once they find something that hits and that works and it sticks, then they fire the cannonball, and the cannonball's calibrated, so they're doubling down on what's working basically. And so that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. And one example he gave is when Apple wanted to open up a retail store, and some people would say, open 20, 40 retail stores, and he was advised, no, just open one, test the concept, get it working, get the product right, get the look right. Once you have the customers coming in and it's working, then you can, scale it up and build 20, 40 stores. And so that's what he did, and it took time because the first launch of their first store, it was rubbish. It took them a while to really get it and refine it and test it. And then once they had a good model, then they could expand that. And so, you see other successful companies doing that, like Uber, where they, start in one market, they refine it, they get good at what they're doing, they have a model that works, it's profitable. Once they have enough data and they tested it with enough bullets, then they throw the cannonballs and they, throw everything at it to expand as quickly as possible. So that's a really good analogy. I think a lot of people in marketing do the same thing. A lot of businesses throw down a lot of money on things like SEO, spending all their marketing budget on something that's not tested. They're just hoping for something. It's like a lottery ticket. You're kind of hoping to land the lottery by just being lucky, but you can't expect that strategy to give you growth over the long term. You're really putting too much risk into your market, into the business, when you throw these big cannonballs around and you haven't tested first, with enough bullets. So I kind of like that as a way of positioning what I do. How I help businesses is to explain that to them, that you can't just throw all your money into one thing. You need to have a way to track and test everything you're doing, and then deploy a small amount of capital to each new idea. A lot of companies had this in their guiding principles, how much money to deploy into a specific idea, no more than 5% of cash reserves or whatever, to really minimize the risk if something doesn't work. And so that's a really good way of looking at it, making sure you don't break those rules, those principles. He gives some examples of successful companies like Progressive that when they break their own rules and they spend a lot of money expanding to a market, it goes against them, then they get crushed by the losses and they have to go back to their rules. So the rule is only as good as the person following it, and that's quite interesting. It's quite powerful, I thought. Let me see what else he wrote. Yeah, basically he said that these 10xers, they accept uncertainty and chaos is going to be in their environment. They don't try and change that, and that's going to be permanent state of business, and it's always accelerating because of technology. So there's more and more disruption, but they take total responsibility for the success. So if they fail, they'll look to leverage what they learned from their failure, not blame the market, not blame the conditions, or as being unlucky or something. And he did this. He kind of did this study, Jim Collins, of what he considered luck to be, and how many successful companies did they have just more luck than the non-successful companies. And there's kind of all this kind of methodology involved in how you define a lucky event. But basically, he worked out that what the successful companies did, they had the same amount of good luck and bad luck. But what they did was when they had the good luck, they were able to capitalize on it because they had the right processes in place and the right system in place. And they were not trying to get rich on one idea. They had lots of different ideas and they had backups. Whereas the companies that have bad luck, that can wipe them out. But the successful companies that have bad luck, what they do differently is they haven't deployed so much of their resources, so they can recover from that, and they can even learn from that. An example he gave was when Progressive, this insurance company, there was a new law that got passed in America, which basically changed their whole business model, and it could have wiped them out. But they started to realize, okay, this is how we need to change the market, and they were actually able to become more successful as a result of learning from this, this difficulty. So definitely challenges can make you grow. And there's another analogy which I really like, which is to do with the NHL. That's the hockey league in America. And they looked at, there's an interesting skew, which is basically kids born earlier in the first half of the year were basically more developed physically than the kids born in the later half of the year. So they were more likely to be successful and get picked in the hockey teams and get into the NHL. So there's this skew in the NHL league where a lot of people are actually born in the first half of the year just because when they were developing, they were slightly more physically developed, and that gave them an advantage over the kids born in the second half of the year. But when they looked at the people from the NHL that got into the Hall of Fame, which is basically like the elite level of hockey, I think 4 players of the year get voted into the Hall of Fame. That was actually 50-50 with the number of people born in the first half of the year versus the second half of the year, which means that the people that had made it, who were physically disadvantaged or challenged or had bad luck to be born in the second half of the year, they actually used that to push them on further, and they persevered and they practiced and they became super disciplined and super focused to get stronger, get better, and they were more motivated, so they actually represented more of the elite level players, even though in the NHL they're a minority. And so that kind of explains how you can look at good luck and bad luck. It's not really how much good luck or bad luck you have, but what's the return on your luck. And that's kind of how he phrases it in the book, to look at, how can you get the best return on your luck. And it's by being prepared when good luck comes along. And then, again, not taking huge risks and firing huge cannonballs into unknown markets or new ideas that could, take you to the death line and wipe your business out. So, yeah, that's some of the things. He gives some examples like, AMD versus Intel. Intel's obviously the giant in that competition, but what they did right was, having the right system, having the right guiding principles. He talks about this framework called specific, methodical, and consistent, which is how you define how the business is going to make decisions. For example, how much to invest in a new business at one time. And the things that 10X companies did right was they were always very specific in how they were going to dominate a market, how fast they were going to grow. They didn't want to grow too fast because that put them at risk when the market goes bad, that they have to lay off people or they lose a lot of money. And so during good times, some of the companies might get more limelight in the media because they're growing super fast, and these 10X companies will get bad media coverage because they're not being adventurous or risky enough and not keeping up. But then when a recession comes along, their competitors get wiped out, bought up by these 10X companies, because these are the guys that have tons of cash reserves, tons of barriers, and they're prepared for this black swan event. So that's really how they're staying the course, and that's how these businesses last. So it's really all about discipline, and that's kind of what I took away from it, and that you need to really have the data. And it's not just, you can't just innovate and grow faster than everyone else, because if the growth isn't sustainable, like Scott, you'll end up freezing in the cold. Versus someone like Amundsen, who takes a steady principle and just marches 20 miles a day towards his goal. Whether the weather's good, whether the weather's bad, he's just doing the same amount of work day in, day out, and that consistency is really key. Another thing another quote that I took away from it was, he says that greatness is not through luck or circumstance, but it's how you prepare and react to it. And so it's really, we all have good luck and bad luck, and why do some people get the good life? And this is really it. It's your mindset and your discipline. And I've had to struggle with my business, trying to find, what's the fastest way to grow my business, and maybe taking too many risks, firing too many cannonballs, but not enough bullets to really test these ideas out first. And a lot of my clients and customers, struggle with this too. They'll get sold the latest shiny toy, and they'll be trying out some new marketing, and they have no idea if it works or not, but they'll throw a bunch of money at it. And then, they had nothing left to try anything else, and they've blown all their gunpowder. So you got to keep some powder dry for other ideas, so you can test lots of things at once, and not be in danger of getting wiped out when something doesn't work out for you. So yeah, the return on luck versus good luck and bad luck, I really like that theme, and it's the idea that you need to be able to stay in the game long enough to even have a shot at luck. And the way you do that is you build up these buffers to ride through periods of uncertainty, so you don't hit the death line and get wiped out. And so he kind of gives that story from lots of angles and lots of examples of different businesses. But yeah, it was a really good book. I really enjoyed it. There's a couple other books he wrote, this Jim Collins guy, is Good to Great and Built to Last. So I'm going to be reading through those next, thinking how I can apply that to my business to really make sure that I'm doing something consistent every day, and not just trying to get lucky or take a big swing at something, but really practicing consistently. And being strategic in how I deploy money and investing into the business, and which direction to take it in as well. There's so many ideas, with internet marketing. You could do so many things, but you don't know which one's going to work, and you should always have a backup. One really good example he gave as well was with Bill Gates and Microsoft. When they were starting to develop an operating system, there was the front runner was actually IBM developing the OS/2 system, and so Bill Gates, his paranoia was so high. He was always thinking, what if this doesn't work? What's my backup? And so that productive paranoia led him to keep a team developing Windows, even when inside the company, inside Microsoft, a lot of people told Bill Gates, you shouldn't be doing this, we should be focusing on OS/2. But he kept some people on there developing Windows, and it turns out OS/2 didn't happen for whatever reason. It disappointed the market. Bill Gates was ready, came in with Windows, instant hit, and that's where they made their big money. And so you don't always know what's going to be your most productive, your profitable service or product. And Apple's a great example as well. When the iPod first came out, it was a tiny percent of revenue. It was maybe 3% of the revenue in their profit and loss in their reports. So they didn't even think it was going to take off, and then all of a sudden it just blew up when they figured out that people wanted to consume content and music, and they built iTunes for not only for the Mac but for the PC. And then suddenly, obviously, their market share in that market just blew up, and people started buying iTunes and songs and on iPods, and that became a huge part of their business. But they had no idea that it was going to be so successful. So you don't always know where your success is going to be, but if you have this productive paranoia, you'll always be working on enough things and kind of diversifying in that way, but not just throwing everything into one basket. And it's kind of, that whole analogy of not throwing all your eggs in one basket. So that's most of the book. And yeah, I read it in 2 days, so I think I got a lot out of it. The speed reading thing I've been doing recently is really working. So if you haven't seen that video on my blog, then check that out on the YouTube channel. I'm reading basically a book every 2 days, 3 days now, so I'm getting through a lot of material. I'd like to record more videos, but I'm pretty busy with work as well. So yeah, that's it for now. I'll be back with the next one. Thanks for watching.